Thank you for having me today. My name is Simeon, and currently I'm in Malaysia. And I will discuss with you today about the case of when internationalization goes awry, the separation of policy and practice, intellectual property rights. Now, this is basically a research was published last year as a chapter, a book chapter, in the delivering distinctive value in emerging economies. So the findings I will present today is based already been published in a book. Now, I will start my conversation discussing about internationalization, which has been explained extensively in international business literature. Now, internationalization, it assumes that the international development of firms as, we call them market actors, follows a gradual, follows a stepwise process, stepwise path. And this assumption, however, contradicts the negative perspective of international operations, such as the decoupling internationalization I will discuss with you today. Now, in this study was published, we tried to adopt a policy practice perspective in the form of intellectual property rights to explain decoupling and internationalization. Now, for example, in the bilateral dispute between China and US over intellectual property rights a few years back has created, we all know, an environment of two different national interests, the US and China, on intellectual property standards, leading to tense bilateral relations while at the same time lessening market interactions. Now, under this kind of circumstances, which is common nowadays to appearing in the market, many firms had to adapt, of course, and make, let's say, quick decisions whether to remain or exit the market. Now, with trade agreements in place, countries, they recognize that internationalization is a key factor from economic growth. The challenge for them is, of course, is to put in place policies that stimulate market development, since institutional differences between countries, between states, create challenges, most of the times not favorable to trade interactions. Is that okay? You can all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So theoretically, these challenges are reflected in the institutional theory of organizational institutionalism and institutional economics. Organizational institutionalism emphasizes on legitimacy, that despite institutional differences between countries, a firm willingly or unwillingly comply with institutional restrictions. Whereas the institutional economics, on the other hand, focuses on the differences in institutional environments towards economic activities. Now, in this study, both perspectives are highly relevant. However, we choose to focus on the organizational institutionalism as it is more closely related to intellectual property rights, such as institutional legitimacy and compliance. Specifically, we explore how firms choose to decouple or de-internationalize because of restrictions related to intellectual property rights. We argue that responses are reflected in the firm's decision to unintentionally, intentionally decouple and involuntarily or voluntarily de-internationalize. We explain that when firms are controlled by institutional legitimacy, they need to comply with restrictions. This is what drives their responses, basically. Our decision to adopt the intellectual property rights perspective, it helps to explain, first of all, the practical value of decoupling, and of course, second, the practical value of the internationalization, making them more approachable in theory as we would describe their diversity. Institutional theory explains how the environment impact actors and, of course, the interaction with institutions. According to the theory, there are three pillars in the environment: the regulative, the normative, and the cognitive, in where institutions influence decision-making, enabling firms to manage interactions. Following the institutional theory of the most well-known pillars, these three pillars, shows that the regulative pillar promotes conformity and compliance in our case. The cognitive pillar emphasizes on what is typical or taken for granted, whereas the normative pillar shows what is appropriate even in the absence of institutional restrictions. That means firms do not absorb constraints. Now, all pillars adopt policy and practice perspective. In particular, the regulative is able to explain our logic of decoupling and de-internationalization. Now, the theory of decoupling explains why firms do or do not implement policies adopted by themselves, whereas de-internationalization explains why firms reduce participation in international operations. In both situations, conformity and compliance play a major role. Conformity explains a voluntary formation to meet, or surpass norms and obligations, not necessarily codified in standards and law. Whereas compliance, on the other hand, is the substance of a completion of institutional restrictions. Now, based on conformity and compliance, decoupling is a policy practice response when firms adopt policies in form, but not in substance. Now, the motivation behind decoupling comes in two forms. Comes, first of all, as ceremonial compliance, and the second one is as substantive compliance. Ceremonial compliance exists when we follow an outward and external business practices. We show an inward business alignment with institutional policies. Whereas the substantive compliance exists when we follow business practices, we show the business alignment with institutional policies. For example, inward practice, inward policy; outward practice, outward policy. We practice as we preach, basically. So decoupling motivated by substantive compliance is a true reflection of international business, and therefore is less harmful when it maintains a policy practice orientation, and in other words, it can contribute to internationalization. In the case of de-internationalization and compliance, what we see, the alternative, what I was explaining before, is very dangerous when, through substantive compliance, firms may be forced to de-internationalize. De-internationalization represents a serious threat when, for example, the competitive edge we have built over the years in the market environment may disappear either through substantive or ceremonial compliance. Consequently, firms needs to ensure that despite facing challenges due to market complexity, they will continue to internationalize. Now, one description of de-internationalization is well illustrated by the bilateral dispute between China and US over the intellectual property rights, like a few years back, during Trump era. Now, both countries recognize that internationalization for them is a key, even today, is a key for economic growth, and thus they need to put in place policies to stimulate programs for market actors to involve. However, because the complex policy of intellectual property rights, many firms decide to de-internationalize. A firm, for example, will be in substantive compliance to intellectual property rights given the institutional restrictions in the local market, wherever this business is established. Now, if it intends to expand to another country, the firm may choose to ceremonially or substantively comply with specific restrictions, intellectual property rights restrictions. Now, a ceremonial compliance with a country's law, with a target country's law, may lead to fast-track internationalization, but let's say due to complexity of intellectual property rights, may also lose their own competitive edge. So a substantive compliance, however, may be subject to examination by institutional authorities. Now, either way, substantive or ceremonial, the firm may be discouraged from internationalize, or if already is internationalizing, may be encouraged to de-internationalize. So the four possible scenarios to compliance illustrate here the reality and effect of decoupling and de-internationalization as an international operation because of the policy and practice outcome. Now, adopting a policy perspective of de-internationalization is basically for two core reasons. Now, the first reason is straightforward, given that countries differ in their rules and regulations, differences are reflected, of course, in the firm's export or entry modes. And the second one is that the states recognize internationalization as a key factor for economic growth, and as a result, they are challenged to put in place policies to stimulate export entry modes despite institutional restrictions vary in their own complexity. Now, if we think about it, currently this is not the case, as complexity between local and international intellectual property rights occasionally allow market actors to bypass to escape institutional restrictions. Institutional restrictions and complexity, if we merit them based on the intellectual property rights or standards and restrictions, have created many challenges on the path of internationalization for both market actors and, of course, for both the involved states. Now, neither the state nor market actors can detach themselves from institutional restrictions. And these two different interests, we see that coexist in tension, with market actors planning to eventually decide on any decisions they take based on their own scenario of compliance. Now, making distinction between market actors and intellectual property rights then becomes difficult, as the firm's interests involuntarily or voluntarily may join with national interests. Now, although market actors and the state's national interests are bound by the same intellectual property policies, the practices when enforcing these restrictions differ in the case of decoupling and de-internationalization. The complexity of intellectual property rights causes an intentional and unintentional decoupling. Decoupling is intentional when firms deliberately, purposely choose to ceremonially comply or else, let's say, symbolically adopt institutional restrictions. For instance, if in countries where regulatory controls are weak, market actors see themselves as victims of an uncertain environment. Now, this environment helps firms to ceremonially comply or even avoid restrictions altogether. Decoupling, however, this is from one point of view. Decoupling, however, may not always be intentional. For example, when contradictory interests leads to poor implementation, and what is happening, it prevents from realizing the benefits we gain from intellectual property rights. So the result is an unintentional decoupling where we accept particular practice as appropriate, but we don't accept it as intended. I can give you an example, but not necessarily it applies in this case. When market actors, for example, underestimate authorities, they disconnect the constrained absorption of institutional restrictions and the actual scenario of compliance. Now, firms' internationalization is complex, that often requires the market actors to involuntarily or voluntarily de-internationalize from international operations. Although the internationalization often we see it as a failure, is considered a failure, it is not necessarily a voluntary failure, a voluntary one. Market actors are generally reluctant to restrict or abandon export market, for no firm inherently wants to fail in international business. And as a result, the internationalization can be explained as a response that corrects previous failures, voluntary or involuntary. Institutional restrictions are often goes beyond the firm's control, results in these types of failure, and thus what is happening, it triggers the internationalization. For instance, due to political or national instability, we can just think Russia war in Ukraine, market actors, despite following institutional restrictions, are forced to de-internationalize. As a sign of failure, the internationalization can be harmful to reputation as well. And firms, for this reason, are reluctant to follow because institutional restrictions is beyond their own control. However, the internationalization may be also beneficial somehow when firms' response to complexity help them build international business resilience. And because of these reasons, despite the negative meaning of failure, the internationalization can be described as a long-term maneuver leading to the development of new international expansion. Some final remarks. Decoupling, but most important, the internationalization is embedded in intellectual property rights because firms are interested in establishing operations in countries with higher intellectual property rights mechanisms. Now, following this view, we believe the internationalization takes place primarily through the regulative pillar. Once, however, intellectual property rights becomes complex, it can act as a normative pillar based on expectations to facilitate institutional change. Now, in this case, the normative pillar is associated with the regulative pillar because regulations impose specific restrictions and failure to follow those restrictions may result in the internationalization. Similarly, the internationalization represents a challenge to the existing intellectual property rights, as it suggests there is a cognitive pillar as well. The cognitive pillar emphasizes on what is typical or taken for granted, and as a result, the complexity of intellectual property rights in a country acts as a representation to the rest of the world. And as a result, if changes comes from the state's institutional institutions or institutional actors willing to challenge the status quo. Now, in this study, we explain that market actors experience complexity when they are exposed to national interest and, of course, to intellectual property rights institutional restrictions. By relating what we call it institutional logic, in the case of national interest and institutional complexity based on intellectual property rights, we can explain decoupling and deinternationalization. Now, when facing pressure to align with national interests and comply with intellectual property rights institutional restrictions, firms develop a set of maneuvers intentionally or unintentionally decouple. And because of institutional complexities, occasionally it goes beyond the firm's control, for example, national or political risks. Market actors develop again a set of maneuvers to voluntary or involuntary deinternationalize. And as a result, when decision makers, in the form of state, in the form of country, of state, of an institution, of a firm, of an individual, when decision makers we understand the interaction between institutional restrictions, intellectual property rights, decoupling, and deinternationalization, they can offer, we believe they can offer a better policy practice perspective in international business. And with that in mind, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. Are there any questions in the room? Oh, we have a question.
I have a question. If oh, it's not on. Oh, okay. Yes, it wasn't clear to me how if there is the patent violations in a certain country happen, how the vendor that holds the patent can, in a sense, go after them. How can they find out? Also, can you tell us a little bit about that? And is there a kind of an international forum for such arbitrations, or how it is resolved?
I'm not aware of this. I'm not aware of this forum. With respect to the formation of one of the four facades of intellectual property rights, we see it based generically. We don't focus on patents.
Well, but patents are an important intellectual property right, and
yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those. It's not only patents.
It's not only, yes, but I was asking specifically.
Yeah, we don't focus on that.
Because, for example, if it is within the U.S., certainly these issues are resolved in the U.S. courts. But there are other countries, and I don't want to kind of identify one. They have a history going all the way many, many years ago where, for example, books, scientific books, for example, were replicated and, with no attribution to the copyrights of the European publisher, for example, or the US publisher.
This goes back to 17th, 18th century, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very old story.
Well, I was talking about in the 70s at this point.
Yeah, it's old. The story is very old. It's very bad.
I think because maybe this was a market that, it was not worth going after at that time. That was not addressed. But, more recently with technologies, big stakes in various technologies, I was wondering whether the kind of processes have changed. But you say you're not aware of what. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your comment. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We invite the participants online if there's any question. If not, I think we're going to close the session. Thank you very much, Mr. Mandrinas.
Thanks so much.
Have a great afternoon.
Mine is, let me see the time, it's 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, okay. So sleep tight.
Thank you so much. Nice. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.